Good morning, good afternoon. Now we will be preparing for our Unit 7 test on tomorrow. We're going to start off with some key vocabulary words that you should know. Abiogenesis. Abiogenesis can be found on page 144 of your packet. Abiogenesis is the belief that life started from non-living things. Next, we have spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation can also be found on page 144 of your packet. Spontaneous generation is the belief that things can come from decaying matter. Life can start from non-living things. Biogenesis, also on page 144. Biogenesis is the belief that living things can only come from other living things. The endosymbiotic theory or hypothesis is on page 146 and continues to page 147. Endosymbiotic theory is a theory that states that all cells started off as unicellular cells and eventually started consuming other cells and became these multicellular cells that we have today. Natural selection. Natural selection is on page 151. Natural selection is the belief that individuals that have the best traits or the best adaptations will be able to survive and reproduce and pass their traits on to their offspring. Overproduction is also on page 151. Overproduction is saying that organisms will produce more offspring than they know can survive. Competition on page 151 as well. Competition is the fact that you have more organisms than can survive. They will compete for resources such as food, mates, shelter. Survival of the fittest on page 151. Survival of the fittest, those with the best traits will be able to live and pass the traits on to the next generation. Adaptations on page 151. Adaptation is a mutation or a trait that's going to be beneficial for you to survive in an environment. Gene pool is on page 162. A gene pool is the gene that, or the genes that are available in a specific organisms or a specific species. Mutation on page 162. Mutation is a change in your genetic instructions or your DNA. Speciation is also on page 162. Speciation is when organisms separate to have a better chance of survival, and they are unable to reproduce with other organisms that were similar to them. Therefore, they create their own species, also known as speciation. Geographic isolation is when organisms split up and go to different areas. Reproductive isolation is when organisms are not able to reproduce with other organisms, which makes them their own species. Fossils. Fossils are on page 156. Biochemical evidence is on page 157. Homologous structures on page 156. Stereostructures 156. Resistance is on page 163. Fossils we know are remains that's left in the ground. They are the remains of animals or organisms that once lived. Biochemical evidence is like DNA fingerprint. It's using DNA or proteins and amino acids to compare organisms, see how closely related they are. Homology structure, homos means same, so we're looking for similar features or same looking features with different functions. Vestigial, kind of like a vest. Vestigial are structures that are in the body today and have no purpose. However, back then, it used to have a purpose. Resistance just means will not affect. All right, so let's talk about 15 statements that you should know before we move into our test tomorrow. I will describe the first cell. The first cell was unicellular, prokaryotic, anaerobic, heterotroph cells. I will analyze experimental evidence that proves spontaneous generation could have occurred. We watched a video about that. I will explain the formation of eukaryotic cells according to the endosymbiotic theory, page 146, 147. What we believe is that all cells started off as unicellular, and then once they started consuming other cells, they became these multicellular animal and plant cells that we have today. I will analyze the experiments of Reedy and Pasteur and disprove spontaneous generation under current conditions. Two experiments basically on page 144. Just wanted to show you how if you cover up the decaying matter, no living matter will be formed. I will examine examples of fossil evidence as it pertains to evidence for evolution. We did the stations around the room comparing different types of fossils. I will analyze amino acid sequences. We did that on page 154, 155, and 157. Basically, the more DNA or amino acids you have in common, the more similar you are, which could show that you have a common ancestor. I will analyze homologous and vestigial structures to identify evolutionary relationships. We did this in our stations around the room on page 155 and 154, 153, 152, 151. And we took notes on this on page 156. Again, homologous, homo means same. So same looking features, different functions, or vestigial structures, features that are in our body right now and have no purpose. I will explain the process of natural selection, including variation over production, competition, survival of the best adapted. We did this on page 151, where we talked about animals. Animals start off looking different. That's variation. Animals, when they reproduce, they make more than can survive in the environment. That's overproduction. These animals are going to compete for resources competition. The best adaptations would be able to survive and be passed on. I will apply Darwin's process of natural selection to the evolution of a favorable trait in a specific organism. We talked about giraffes, so you saw my picture of the giraffe and how the long-necked giraffes had the favorable trait, so they were able to live on. I'll explain that mutation in sexual reproduction provides the variation necessary for the process of natural selection. We saw that mutations is a change in the DNA. Because everyone looks different, natural selection is able to select the best differences or the best mutations. I'll explain that organisms with favorable adaptations survive, reproduce, and pass those adaptations to the offspring. Survival of the fittest. I'll review the process of natural selection in a population of organisms. That's my giraffe example.